The gunshot echoed through the dense pine forest as Beatrice Carter sprinted through the underbrush, her tattered blue dress catching on brambles and thorns. Blood trickled down her forearm from where the bullet had grazed her, but the pain was nothing compared to the terror of being dragged back to the gilded prison she'd just escaped. The year was 1876, and in the rugged Sierra Nevada foothills of California, a woman's freedom was as precarious as morning mist. "Get back here, you ungrateful witch!" The voice of her pursuer, her husband in name, only boomed through the trees. Harold Whitfield, the wealthiest man in Colfax, California, was not accustomed to losing his possessions, and he considered Beatrice the most valuable of them all. Beatrice's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her boots slipping on the pine needles covering the forest floor. She had to reach the main road. Anyone, might be traveling and could help her. 2 years of calculated planning, of squirreling away small sums of money, of memorizing Harold's schedule, all culminating in this desperate flight through the wilderness. She couldn't fail now. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east gave her a moment of panic. Was it Harold's men, cutting her off? With no choice but to hide, Beatrice dove behind a fallen log, pressing herself into the earth. The scent of decaying leaves and damp soil filled her nostrils as she tried to quiet her ragged breathing. The rider slowed, and Beatrice risked a glance. A tall man sat atop a chestnut stallion, his face obscured by the brim of a worn cowboy hat. His duster was dusty from the trail, and a Winchester rifle was secured to his saddle. He wasn't one of Harold's men, she knew all of them by sight, but that didn't mean he wouldn't turn her in for a reward. The stranger dismounted, leading his horse toward a small stream that cut through the forest. Beatrice remained motionless, weighing her options. The shouts behind her were growing closer. Harold and his men were gaining ground. Making a split-second decision, Beatrice rose to her feet and stepped into the clearing. "Sir," she called, her voice trembling, "please help me." The cowboy turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. He relaxed slightly when he saw her, a bedraggled woman with wild hair and a bloodied arm. "Madam," he acknowledged, his voice deep and cautious. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, quickly assessed her disheveled state. "Are you hurt?" "They're coming for me," Beatrice said, glancing over her shoulder. "My husband, he's not a good man. He'll kill me if he finds me." The cowboy's expression hardened. "How many men?" "4, including my husband." He nodded once, decisive. "My cabin's not far. Get on my horse." Beatrice hesitated. Trading one man's custody for another's wasn't her plan, but the approaching voices left her little choice. "I don't know you," she said, backing away slightly. "Name's Hank Voss," he said, extending a calloused hand. "And I don't make a habit of returning escaped birds to their cages." Something in his eyes of fierce integrity perhaps made Beatrice take his hand. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. With a click of his tongue, the horse took off through the trees, moving with surprising stealth for such a large animal. They rode for what seemed like hours, taking winding game trails and crossing streams to mask their trail. Beatrice's body ached, the adrenaline fading to reveal every bruise and cut from her escape. She found herself leaning back against Hank's solid chest, grateful for his steady presence. As the sun began to set, they emerged from the forest into a small clearing. A sturdy log cabin stood before them, smoke curling from its chimney. A corral held 2 other horses, and a small garden was visible at the side of the house. "You live here alone?" Beatrice asked as Hank helped her dismount. "Just me and the horses," he confirmed, leading her to the cabin door. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking pot hanging over glowing embers. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, while a curtain partially concealed a bed in the corner. Rifles hung on the wall, alongside tools and dried herbs. "Sit," Hank instructed, gesturing to a chair as he stoked the fire. "Let me see that arm." Beatrice sank onto the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "Thank you," she murmured as Hank brought a basin of water and clean rags. "Don't thank me yet," he said grimly. "Whitfield isn't the type to give up easily. I know his reputation." Beatrice's head snapped up. "You know who my husband is." Hank's mouth tightened as he gently cleaned the wound on her arm. "Everyone in 3 counties knows Harold Whitfield. Mining baron, railroad investor, and—" He hesitated. "Tyrant," Beatrice finished for him. "You can say it." "Not my place to judge another man's character," Hank said diplomatically, "but I've heard things, seen how his workers are treated." He examined her arm carefully. "This needs stitching." Beatrice nodded, steeling herself for the pain. As Hank retrieved a needle and thread, she asked, "What do you do, Mr. Voss? Are you a rancher?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Used to be. Now I hunt, trap, do odd jobs, enough to get by." "And you're not afraid of crossing Harold Whitfield?" Hank threaded the needle with practiced ease. "I've faced worse than a man who hides behind his money and hired guns." He met her eyes steadily. "This will hurt." Beatrice bit her lip as he began to stitch the wound, but didn't cry out. She'd endured far worse at Harold's hands over the past 5 years. As Hank worked, she studied his face tanned from the sun, lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though his expression was serious now. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his short beard. "How did you end up married to Whitfield?" Hank asked, perhaps to distract her from the pain. Beatrice sighed. "My father owed him money. I was 16 when Harold proposed the arrangement, my hand in marriage to clear the debt. My father agreed without consulting me." Hank's fingers paused in their work, his eyes darkening. 16. "I'm 21 now," she said quietly. "For 5 years I've lived in that mansion like a prisoner. He parades me at social events, locks me in my room when we return, and—" She trailed off, unwilling to speak of the worst indignities. Hank finished the stitching in silence, then bandaged her arm. "You need food and rest," he said finally. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." "I can't stay," Beatrice protested. "He'll search every home in the county." "This cabin isn't on any map," Hank assured her. "And I doubt Whitfield's men are skilled enough trackers to find us." He moved to the fireplace, stirring a pot of stew. "One night, at least. You're in no condition to travel farther." Beatrice couldn't argue with that. Her entire body ached, and the prospect of a hot meal and safe shelter was too tempting to refuse. "Just one night," she agreed. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming Beatrice from within. As the meal ended, Hank rose and gathered some blankets. "Take the bed," he said, gesturing to the corner. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed, you can and will," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You need proper rest." Too tired to protest further, Beatrice retreated behind the curtain and sank onto the simple but comfortable bed. Despite her fears, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She woke to the sound of voices outside the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the small window, indicating it was mid-morning. Beatrice had slept longer than she had in years. "I'm telling you, I haven't seen anyone matching that description." Hank's voice came clearly through the logs. "Been here alone for days. Whitfield's offering $500 for information leading to his wife's return," a gruff voice replied. "Sure you haven't seen a pretty brunette running through these woods?" "If I had $500, I wouldn't be living in this shack," Hank said with a laugh that sounded forced to Beatrice's ears. "Now, if you don't mind, I've got traps to check." Beatrice held her breath until she heard horses riding away. Moments later, Hank entered the cabin, his expression grim. "They're combing the entire area," he said without preamble. "Whitfield's offering enough money to tempt even honest men." "I need to leave," Beatrice said, rising from the bed. Her dress was torn and stained, hardly suitable for further travel. As if reading her thoughts, Hank pulled a bundle from a trunk. "My sister's clothes," he explained. "She stays here sometimes. They might be a bit large, but they're clean." Beatrice accepted the bundle gratefully. "Your sister won't mind." A shadow passed across Hank's face. "She passed away last winter, influenza." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly. Hank nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. "Get changed. We need to discuss your plan." While Hank waited outside, Beatrice changed into the simple cotton dress and woolen shawl. Both were indeed a bit large, but infinitely better than her ruined clothing. When she emerged, Hank was saddling his horse. "Where will you go?" he asked without looking up from his task. Beatrice hesitated. "I have an aunt in San Francisco. She never approved of my marriage. I think she would help me." "San Francisco is a long journey from here," Hank observed, tightening the saddle girth. "And Whitfield will have men watching the stage stations and train depots." "I know," Beatrice said, despair creeping into her voice. "But I have nowhere else to go." Hank turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I could take you," he offered. "I know routes that avoid the main roads. It would take longer, but we'd be less likely to be spotted." Beatrice stared at him in surprise. "You would do that? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "No woman deserves to be hunted like an animal." Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of approaching horses silenced them both. Hank's hand went to his revolver as he moved to the window. "Whitfield himself," he muttered, "with 3 men. Panic seized Beatrice. "They must have followed your visitors." Hank's mind worked quickly. "Go out the back. There's a cellar door hidden under brush. Get inside and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. What about you?" "I'll handle Whitfield." His eyes met hers. "Trust me, Beatrice." Something in his steady gaze gave her courage. She nodded once and slipped out the back door, finding the hidden cellar entrance exactly where Hank had described. The small space smelled of earth and stored vegetables, but it was dry and secure. Beatrice pulled the door closed over her head just as she heard Harold's voice. "Voss, I know you're in there. Come out and face me like a man." From her hiding place, Beatrice could hear muffled voices. Hank's measured tones contrasted with Harold's imperious demands. She couldn't make out the words, but the tension was palpable even through the ground above her head. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Beatrice clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle her scream. More shots followed, then the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. A fight had erupted in the cabin. Beatrice trembled in the darkness, torn between hiding and rushing to help Hank. Had he been shot? Was he even now bleeding out while she cowered in the cellar? The chaos above eventually subsided. Heavy footsteps crisscrossed the cabin floor, followed by Harold's voice ordering his men to search the surrounding area. Beatrice pressed herself into the farthest corner of the cellar, praying they wouldn't find the hidden door. Hours seemed to pass. The sounds of the search grew distant, then faded entirely. Still, Beatrice remained hidden, afraid to emerge. Only when the cellar door creaked open, revealing Hank's battered face, did she allow herself to breathe. "They're gone," he said, extending a hand to help her out. "For now." Beatrice gasped at the sight of him. A cut above his eye had painted half his face with blood, and he held his left arm at an awkward angle. "You're hurt." "I've had worse." Hank dismissed her concern but winced as he straightened. "Whitfield's men aren't much for fighting fair." The cabin was in shambles, furniture overturned, windows broken, and bullet holes peppering the walls. Hank's few possessions were scattered across the floor. "I'm so sorry," Beatrice whispered, surveying the destruction. "This is my fault." "No," Hank said firmly. "This is Harold Whitfield's fault, and it changes nothing. I'm still taking you to San Francisco." Beatrice shook her head. "Look at you, you're injured, and they'll be watching for us now." "Which is why we leave immediately," Hank said, already gathering supplies into a saddlebag. "They'll expect us to hole up here or head east. We'll go north first, through the high country, then cut west to the coast." "Hank, please," Beatrice pleaded. "You've done enough. I can't ask you to risk more for me." Hank paused in his preparations, turning to face her fully. "You didn't ask." "I'm offering." His blue eyes held hers intently. "Unless you'd rather face this journey alone." The prospect of continuing her flight without Hank's protection was terrifying. Despite having known him for barely a day, Beatrice trusted him more than any man she'd encountered since her father sold her to Harold Whitfield. "No," she admitted softly. "I wouldn't." "Then it's settled." Hank returned to packing. "We leave in 10 minutes. Take only what you can carry." They departed as the sun began its descent. Hank leading his chestnut stallion and a newly saddled mare through the dense forest rather than along any trail. His rifle was ready in one hand, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Beatrice followed closely, her heart pounding with each distant sound. As darkness fell, they made camp in a small hollow surrounded by boulders. Hank built a fire pit but didn't light it. "Too risky," he explained, handing Beatrice some jerky and hard biscuits. "We'll eat cold tonight." They ate in silence, listening to the forest sounds. After their meager meal, Hank unrolled a bedroll for Beatrice. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take first watch." "You need rest too," Beatrice protested, noting the lines of pain around his eyes. "Especially with your injuries." "I'll wake you in a few hours," he promised, settling against a boulder with his rifle across his knees. Beatrice wanted to argue but knew he was right. One of them needed to stay alert. She slipped into the bedroll, whispering, "Thank you, Hank," before exhaustion claimed her once more. The next days fell into a pattern. Riding by day through increasingly rugged terrain, camping in hidden locations by night. Hank proved to be an expert woodsman, finding game for their meals and fresh water even in seemingly barren landscapes. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but his actions, the way he always gave Beatrice the better portions of food, how he positioned himself between her and any perceived danger, spoke volumes. On the 4th night, as they camped beside a mountain stream, Beatrice finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "Why are you helping me, really? You've lost your home, risked your life. And for what?" Hank was silent for so long that Beatrice thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tinged with old pain. "I had a wife once. Emily, she was." He paused, searching for words. "She was everything good in my life. We had a small ranch near Sacramento." Beatrice waited, sensing this was difficult for him to share. "There was a wealthy landowner who wanted our property. When I refused to sell, he began making threats. I didn't take them seriously enough." Hank's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "One day, I returned from town to find our house burning. Emily was inside." "Oh, Hank," Beatrice breathed, her heart breaking for him. "I tried to save her. That's how I got this." He touched the scar along his jawline. "But I was too late. The landowner claimed it was an accident and the law sided with him. He had money, influence." "Like Harold," Beatrice murmured. Hank nodded grimly. "I hunted him for months, nearly killed him when I found him. But at the last moment I couldn't pull the trigger, not in cold blood. So I walked away, left everything behind, and found that cabin in the woods." His eyes met hers across the small camp. I couldn't save Emily, but maybe I can help you escape the same fate. Impulsively, Beatrice reached across and placed her hand over his. I'm so sorry about Emily, and I'm grateful more than I can say for your help. Something shifted in Hank's expression, a softening around the eyes. For a brief moment, Beatrice thought he might turn his hand to clasp hers, but instead he withdrew, standing abruptly. We should get some rest. Long ride tomorrow. As the days passed and they moved farther from Colfax, Beatrice noticed subtle changes in their relationship. Hank spoke more freely, occasionally sharing stories from his childhood in Missouri, his journey west during the gold rush, his years as a rancher. In turn, Beatrice told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher before her marriage, her love of books, and her secret hobby of writing poetry that Harold had forbidden. You should pursue that teaching ambition in San Francisco, Hank suggested one evening as they sat beside a small campfire, deep enough in the wilderness now to risk the flame. You have a natural way with words. Beatrice smiled, warmed by his encouragement. Perhaps I will. If my aunt will have me. She'd be a fool not to, Hank said with such conviction that Beatrice felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Their journey took them through towering redwood forests, across swift-flowing rivers, and along steep mountain trails. Each obstacle they overcame together strengthened the bond between them. Hank taught Beatrice to fish, to identify edible plants, and most importantly, to shoot his spare revolver. I pray you'll never need to use it, he said, as he positioned her hands correctly on the weapon. But every woman should know how to defend herself. His proximity, as he guided her aim, sent an unfamiliar flutter through Beatrice's stomach. She found herself increasingly aware of the strength in his hands, the timbre of his voice, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally illuminated his features. It was dangerous, these growing feelings. Beatrice was still legally married, still hunted, still vulnerable. Attachment to Hank would only complicate an already perilous situation. Yet each evening as they made camp, each morning as they set out side by side, the connection between them deepened. On the 10th day of their journey, disaster struck. They were crossing a narrow pass between two mountains when the crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. Hank's horse reared, nearly throwing him as a bullet struck the ground near its hooves. Ambush, Hank shouted, drawing his rifle. Ride, Beatrice, follow the trail down. Another shot rang out, this one passing so close to Beatrice that she felt the air disturbed by its passage. Heart pounding, she urged her mare forward but couldn't bring herself to abandon Hank. I won't leave you, she called back, drawing the revolver he'd given her. Go. Hank insisted, returning fire at the unseen assailants. I'll be right behind you, torn. Beatrice hesitated until a third shot decided for her, this one catching Hank's stallion in the flank. The horse screamed in pain and collapsed, trapping Hank's leg beneath its bulk. Without thinking, Beatrice wheeled her mare around and galloped back to him, sliding from the saddle even as bullets continued to fly around them. Together, they managed to free Hank's leg, but it was clearly injured. He couldn't put weight on it. Get on the horse, Beatrice urged, helping him stand. We'll both be caught if we try to ride double, Hank argued, his face pale with pain. Take the horse and go. Not without you, Beatrice said firmly, raising her revolver and firing in the direction of their attackers. To her surprise, the shooting from the hillside momentarily ceased. Using the opportunity, she helped Hank mount her mare, then climbed up behind him. The horse protested the double weight, but responded to Beatrice's urgent commands, carrying them down the trail and around a bend that sheltered them from the gunmen. They rode hard until they reached a dense copse of trees, where Hank finally allowed Beatrice to stop and examine his injuries. His leg wasn't broken, but badly bruised and swollen. Worse, during their escape, one of the bullets had creased his side, leaving a bloody furrow across his ribs. "Those weren't random bandits," Hank said grimly as Beatrice cleaned the wound. "They knew exactly where to wait for us." "Harold's men," Beatrice confirmed, her hands trembling as she applied pressure to stop the bleeding. "How did they find us?" "Someone in one of the settlements we passed must have recognized you and sent word," Hank reasoned. "We need to be more careful now." They couldn't travel far with Hank injured, but staying in place was too dangerous. By nightfall, they'd managed only a few miles, finally taking shelter in a small cave hidden behind a waterfall. The constant noise of the falling water would mask any sounds they made and cover their scent from tracking dogs. Inside the cave, Beatrice built a tiny fire, just enough to boil water for cleaning Hank's wounds. As she tended to him, she couldn't help but notice the map of scars across his torso, evidence of a hard life lived on the frontier. "You should have left me," Hank said softly as she bandaged his side with strips torn from her petticoat. "You could be miles ahead by now." Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I couldn't do that." "Why?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Instead of answering with words, Beatrice leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, chaste by most standards, but it sent a current of electricity through her body unlike anything she'd ever experienced. When she pulled back, Hank was staring at her, his expression a complex mixture of surprise, desire, and concern. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough. "You don't owe me this. This has nothing to do with owing," she said quietly, "and everything to do with wanting." Hank reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle. "You're still married." "To a monster who bought me like cattle," Beatrice reminded him. "There was never love between us, not for a single moment." "Even so," Hank said, though his hand remained on her cheek, "you deserve better than a wounded fugitive in a cave." Beatrice turned her face to press a kiss into his palm. "I've never felt safer than I do with you, Hank Voss." This time it was Hank who initiated the kiss, drawing her closer with his good arm. His lips were warm and sure against hers, conveying months of loneliness, years of restraint, and a tenderness that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "We should rest," Hank said, though his eyes told a different story. "We've got a long journey ahead." Beatrice nodded, understanding his reluctance to rush. They were both vulnerable, Hank physically and Beatrice emotionally. This fragile connection between them deserved time to develop naturally, without the pressure of their current circumstances. They slept side by side that night, Hank's arm wrapped protectively around Beatrice's waist, her head pillowed on his shoulder. Despite their precarious situation, Beatrice slept more peacefully than she had in years. Morning brought renewed determination. Hank's leg was still painful, but he could ride. They set out at dawn, now heading directly west toward the coast. If they could reach the sea, Hank reasoned, they could find passage on a ship to San Francisco, avoiding the roads where Harold's men would be watching. The going was slow, with frequent stops to rest Hank's leg. Beatrice noticed him growing paler as the day progressed, and by evening, she insisted they make camp early beside a small creek. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she chided as she helped him dismount. "We can't afford to dawdle," Hank argued, though he couldn't suppress a groan of pain as he settled onto a fallen log. "Whitfield's men could be right behind us." Beatrice checked his bandages, concerned to find fresh blood seeping through. "The wound is opening up with all this riding." "You need proper rest, Hank." "What I need is to get you safely to San Francisco," he he countered, catching her hand as she tended to him. "Nothing else matters." "You matter," Beatrice said fiercely. "Don't you understand that by now?" The intensity in her eyes silenced Hank's protests. He nodded once, acquiescing to her care. That evening, as they sat beside their small fire, Hank suddenly asked, "What will you do when we reach San Francisco?" Beatrice had been pondering this very question for days. "Find my aunt. Seek legal counsel about dissolving my marriage." "Will that be possible?" Hank wondered. "Divorce is—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Scandalous," Beatrice finished for him. "I know, but staying married to Harold is unthinkable." She poked at the fire with a stick. "My aunt is progressive in her thinking. She may know lawyers sympathetic to women in my situation." Hank nodded thoughtfully. "And after, Beatrice repeated, not quite understanding. "After you're free," Hank clarified. "What then?" The question hung in the air between them. Beatrice studied Hank's face in the firelight, the strength in his jaw, the kindness in his eyes despite all he'd suffered, the way he looked at her as though she were precious beyond measure. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to return to Colfax." "I understand," Hank said, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features. "The city will offer you opportunities, teaching perhaps, as you mentioned." Beatrice moved to sit beside him on the log. "What about you? After you've delivered me safely to my aunt?" Hank shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "Back to the woods, I suppose. Find a new cabin, new hunting grounds." "Alone?" Beatrice couldn't keep the distress from her voice. Hank's eyes met hers, searching. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether I have a reason to stay in San Francisco." His voice was low, almost a whisper. Beatrice's heart raced as she understood his meaning. "And if you did have a reason," Hank's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "Then I might consider a change of scenery. The sea air might do me good." It wasn't a declaration of love. They were both too cautious, too wounded by the past for such boldness, but it was a promise of possibility that filled Beatrice with hope. They continued westward for another 3 days, moving as quickly as Hank's injury would allow. The landscape gradually changed, the towering inland forests giving way to rolling coastal hills. When they crested a particular rise and Beatrice caught her first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean gleaming in the distance, she gasped in wonder. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Yes," Hank agreed, though he was looking at her rather than the view. "It is." They made camp that night on a bluff overlooking the sea. According to Hank's calculations, they were about 2 days' ride from a coastal settlement where they might find a ship bound for San Francisco. "We'll need to be careful," he warned as they ate their simple meal. "Whitfield's influence might extend to these ports." "Do you think he's still searching for me?" Beatrice wondered. It had been nearly 3 weeks since her escape. "A man like that doesn't give up easily," Hank said grimly. "Especially when his pride is wounded. And you wounded more than his pride." Beatrice glanced down at the simple gold band she still wore. She'd kept it on during their journey, knowing it might provide some protection if they encountered strangers. A lone woman traveling with a man would raise fewer questions if she appeared to be his wife. Now, she twisted it off her finger and held it up to the firelight. "This was never a symbol of love," she said, "just ownership." With a sudden movement, she flung the ring over the bluff, watching as it caught the last rays of sunset before disappearing into the grass below. Hank watched her, his expression unreadable. "Feel better?" "Lighter," Beatrice confirmed with a small smile. "As though I can finally breathe." That night, their kisses were less restrained. Hank's hands tangled in Beatrice's long hair, and she pressed herself against him, seeking closeness. Only his still healing injuries and their mutual agreement to wait until they reached safety prevented them from crossing the final boundary between friendship and something far more intimate. They reached the coastal settlement the next afternoon, a small fishing village with a modest harbor where a few trading vessels were docked. Hank suggested they wait until dark to approach, to minimize the chance of being recognized. As twilight fell, they rode cautiously into town, keeping to the shadows. The village consisted of a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, a general store, a tavern, what appeared to be a boarding house, and various shops. At the far end stood a small church with a weathered steeple. "Wait here," Hank instructed, helping Beatrice dismount in an alley beside the tavern. "I'll find out if any ships are headed to San Francisco." Beatrice nodded, though she disliked being separated from him even briefly. "Be careful." Hank squeezed her hand reassuringly before disappearing into the tavern. Beatrice waited in the shadows, one hand resting on the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. The sounds of the small harbor creaking ships, lapping waves, distant sailors' voices provided a constant backdrop to her anxious thoughts. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Beatrice was beginning to worry when Hank finally emerged from the tavern, moving quickly toward her. "There's a trader leaving for San Francisco at dawn," he reported in a low voice. "The captain's willing to take passengers for a price." "Do we have enough money?" Beatrice asked. They'd been careful with the small sum she'd brought from Colfax, supplemented by what Hank had salvaged before they abandoned his cabin. "Just barely," Hank confirmed. "But there's something else." His expression was grave. "A man in the tavern was asking questions about a woman matching your description, offering money for information." Beatrice's blood ran cold. "Harold's men found us. It seems so. We need to board that ship tonight if the captain will allow it." Hank's eyes scanned the street. "There's the boarding house. We'll get a room, wait a few hours until the tavern quiets down, then make our way to the docks." The boarding house was a simple 2-story building with a sign reading "Moore's Lodging" hanging above the door. Inside, a thin woman with gray-streaked hair sat behind a small desk, eyeing them suspiciously as they entered. "We need a room for the night," Hank said, placing coins on the desk. "My wife and I are catching the morning boat to San Francisco." The woman, Mrs. Moore, presumably counted the coins before reaching for a key. "Room 3, top of the stairs," she said curtly. "No noise, no trouble." They climbed the narrow staircase to find a small, clean room with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair. Hank immediately checked the window, ensuring it could be opened quickly if they needed an escape route. "Try to rest," he told Beatrice. "I'll keep watch." Despite her exhaustion, Beatrice found sleep elusive. Every sound from the street below made her tense, imagining Harold's men bursting through the door. Hank sat in the chair by the window, his rifle across his knees, a silhouette against the moonlight. "Hank," Beatrice whispered after an hour of restless turning. "Come lie down. You need rest too." He hesitated, then set aside his rifle and stretched out beside her on the narrow bed. Beatrice curled against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What if they find us before morning?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. Hank's arm tightened around her. "They won't take you back," he promised, his voice low and fierce. "Not while I'm breathing." Beatrice raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you because of me." In response, Hank pulled her down for a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When they finally parted, he said, "Nothing that's happened since I met you is something I regret, Beatrice." They lay together in the darkness, speaking softly of the future, tentative plans, cautious hopes. Sometime past midnight, they both drifted into uneasy sleep. The pounding on their door came just before dawn. Hank was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, positioning himself between Beatrice and the door. "Open up in there," a gruff voice demanded. "We know you're harboring Beatrice Whitfield." "Mr. Whitfield is offering a generous reward for her safe return." Beatrice clutched Hank's arm, terror stealing her breath. "The window," she gasped. Hank nodded, backing toward it while keeping his rifle trained on the door. The pounding continued, wood splintering as whoever was outside began to force the lock. "Quickly," Hank urged, helping Beatrice onto the windowsill. A small roof overhang extended beneath the window. "Follow the roof to the back of the building. There should be a way down." "What about you?" Beatrice demanded, refusing to move. "Right behind you," Hank promised, though his eyes told a different story. The door burst open before Beatrice could argue further. 3 men rushed in, guns drawn. Hank fired once, hitting the first man in the shoulder, then shouted, "Go, Beatrice! Now!" With no choice, Beatrice scrambled out the window onto the narrow overhang. Behind her, she heard the sounds of struggle grunts, cursing, the thud of fists against flesh. Tears blurred her vision as she edged along the roof, praying Hank would follow. She reached the rear of the building and found a ladder-like arrangement of storage crates that provided a precarious route to the ground. As she descended, more shouting erupted from the room she'd just left. A gunshot rang out, then another, followed by an awful silence. "Hank," Beatrice whispered, her heart in her throat. Had he been shot? Was he dead because of her? She had no time to wonder. Voices from the front of the boarding house indicated more of Harold's men were arriving. Beatrice had to move, had to reach the ship before they sealed off the harbor. The pre-dawn streets were nearly deserted as Beatrice ran toward the docks, keeping to shadows and alleyways. Her mind raced. Should she wait for Hank? Go back for him? But if he was captured or worse, her return would only ensure his sacrifice was in vain. The harbor came into view, silver in the first light of dawn. Several ships were docked, but Beatrice had no idea which was bound for San Francisco. She hesitated at the edge of the wharf, scanning the vessels for signs of activity. A hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling her scream. "Quiet," a familiar voice hissed in her ear. "It's me." Beatrice sagged with relief as Hank released her. He was alive, battered, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but wonderfully, gloriously alive. "I thought they'd killed you," she gasped, throwing her arms around him. "Nearly did," Hank admitted, wincing as she squeezed his ribs. "We need to move. They're right behind me." He led her swiftly along the dock toward a mid-sized vessel where men were loading crates. "That's our ship," he explained, hurrying her up the gangplank. "I paid the captain extra to leave immediately." On board, the captain, a weather-beaten man with a salt and pepper beard, was shouting orders to his crew. He paused when he saw them, his eyes narrowing at their disheveled appearance. "This trouble following you gonna endanger my ship?" he demanded. "No, sir," Hank assured him. "Just some personal matters best left behind." The captain grunted skeptically, but resumed directing the preparations for departure. Hank guided Beatrice to the stern, where they had a clear view of the dock. Already, men were appearing at the harbor's edge, pointing toward the ship. "Cast off," the captain bellowed. The crew hastened to obey, untying ropes and raising the gangplank. The ship began to move away from the dock just as Harold's men reached it. One of them raised a rifle, aiming at the ship. Hank pushed Beatrice down behind the railing as bullets splintered the wood around them. The captain shouted in outrage, and several crewmen produced weapons of their own, returning fire until the distance made further shooting futile. As the ship entered the open water and picked up speed, Beatrice finally allowed herself to believe they might escape. She stood at the railing, watching the shoreline recede, the knot of tension in her chest beginning to unravel. Hank joined her, his shoulder pressing against hers. "We made it," he said quietly. Beatrice turned to look at him, really look at him in the growing light. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, yet she'd never seen anyone more beautiful. "We did," she agreed, reaching for his hand. They sailed through the morning, the coastline a constant presence to their right. According to the captain, they would reach San Francisco by the following afternoon if the weather held. He'd provided them with a small cabin below decks barely large enough for a narrow bunk and a washstand, but private and secure. As evening approached, Beatrice stood on deck, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. Hank approached with 2 mugs of hot coffee, handed one to her, and leaned against the railing. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Knowing you're almost free." Beatrice considered the question. "Strange," she admitted. "For 5 years, every moment was controlled, every movement watched. To make my own choices now, it's overwhelming." "You'll adjust," Hank assured her. "You're stronger than you know." "Only because you helped me find that strength," Beatrice said, turning to face him. "Hank, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't need to thank me," he said, his eyes serious. "But there is something I need to ask you." Beatrice's heart quickened. "What is it?" Hank set down his coffee mug and took both her hands in his. "When we reach San Francisco, when you've settled with your aunt and dealt with the legal matters." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Would you consider a life with me?" Joy bubbled up inside Beatrice like a spring. "Are you asking me to marry you, Hank Voss?" "Eventually," he clarified, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "When you're legally free to make that choice. But yes, I'm asking if you could see a future where we build something together." Beatrice didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply. "There's nothing I want more." Hank's smile broadened into something so radiant, it transformed his entire face. He pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. The ship docked in San Francisco the following afternoon under clear blue skies. The bustling port was unlike anything Beatrice had ever seen. Ships from around the world unloading exotic cargo, merchants hawking wares in a dozen languages, elegant carriages navigating streets filled with every manner of humanity. "It's overwhelming," Beatrice confessed as they made their way through the crowd, her hand firmly clasped in Hank's. "Stay close," he advised, guiding her toward a less frantic side street. "Where does your aunt live?" Beatrice consulted the address she'd memorized years ago. "Nob Hill, I believe." "It's supposed to be quite grand." They hired a modest carriage to take them up the steep hills to one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. As they traveled, Beatrice grew increasingly anxious. What if her aunt refused to help? What if she'd moved? What if Harold had somehow reached her first? The carriage stopped before an impressive 3-story Victorian painted in elegant blues and creams. Beatrice stared up at it, suddenly hesitant. "Would you prefer to approach alone?" Hank asked, sensing her discomfort. Beatrice squeezed his hand. "No, whatever happens, we face it together." They ascended the steps, and Beatrice took a deep breath before lifting the brass knocker. After what seemed an eternity, the door opened to reveal a uniformed maid. "Yes?" the young woman inquired politely. "I'm here to see Mrs. Alina Baldwin," Beatrice said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm her niece, Beatrice." The maid's eyes widened slightly. "One moment, please." She disappeared into the house, leaving them on the doorstep. Minutes later, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair appeared. She stared at Beatrice for a long moment, then exclaimed, "Good heavens!" "Beatrice, is it really you, Aunt Alina?" Beatrice confirmed, tears threatening. "I've come to ask for your help." Alina Baldwin pulled her niece into a fierce embrace. "My dear girl, I've been hoping for this day for years." She stepped back, holding Beatrice at arm's length to examine her. "You look exhausted, both of you. Come in, come in." Inside, the house was as elegant as its exterior suggested: polished wood, rich fabrics, tasteful artwork. Alina led them to a comfortable sitting room and rang for tea before turning her attention to Hank. "And you are?" she asked directly. "Hank Voss, madam," he replied, removing his hat. "I've been helping Beatrice reach you safely." Alina's shrewd eyes took in his battered appearance and the protective way he positioned himself near Beatrice. "I see," she said, though it was clear she perceived more than was being said. "Well, Mr. Voss, it appears I owe you a debt of gratitude." Over tea, Beatrice explained everything: her escape, Harold's pursuit, and the dangerous journey to San Francisco. Alina listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grim. "That despicable man," she muttered when Beatrice finished. "I warned your father against the match, but he was too dazzled by Whitfield's money to listen." She reached across to pat Beatrice's hand. "You'll stay here, of course, both of you, and tomorrow we'll visit my lawyer. George Harrington is the best in the city, and he's handled several divorce cases for women in difficult situations." "Divorce," Beatrice repeated, hardly daring to hope. "Is it possible?" "Difficult, but not impossible," Alina confirmed. "Especially with evidence of cruelty. And from what you've told me, we have ample evidence." "Whitfield won't give up easily," Hank warned. "He's likely already on his way to San Francisco." Alina's smile was coldly determined. "Let him come. My late husband left me with considerable resources and influence of my own. Harold Whitfield isn't the only one with powerful friends." True to her word, Alina arranged a meeting with her lawyer the very next morning. George Harrington was a distinguished man in his 60s, with keen eyes and a reputation for taking on controversial cases. "Mrs. Whitfield," he greeted Beatrice in his wood-paneled office. "Your aunt has explained your situation. I must be frank, divorce is never simple, and in cases where the husband opposes it, doubly so. However, California law does recognize extreme cruelty as grounds for divorce. I can testify to the conditions of her marriage," Hank offered from where he sat beside Beatrice. "I saw firsthand how Whitfield and his men hunted her." Harrington nodded. "Witness testimony will be valuable, but more important will be evidence of Mrs. Whitfield's treatment during the marriage itself." Beatrice swallowed hard. "I have scars," she said quietly, "and there were servants in the house who saw incidents. Would any be willing to testify against their employer?" the lawyer asked skeptically. "Martha might," Beatrice said after consideration. "She was my lady's maid. She often tended to my injuries and once tried to help me escape. Harold dismissed her for it." Harrington made notes. "We'll try to locate this Martha. In the meantime, I'll file the initial petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. Be prepared, Mrs. Whitfield, this will be a public and potentially ugly process." Beatrice straightened her shoulders. "I'm prepared for whatever comes, Mr. Harrington. I've endured worse than public scrutiny." As they left the lawyer's office, Hank took Beatrice's hand. "You were magnificent in there," he said admiringly. "Not many would have your courage." "Fear can only control you if you let it," Beatrice replied, squeezing his hand. "And I'm done being controlled." They returned to Alina's home to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the parlor: Sheriff Thomas Burke from Colfax. "Mrs. Whitfield," he greeted her, rising from his chair. "Your husband is quite concerned about you." Beatrice felt Hank tense beside her, his hand moving toward his gun. She placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Sheriff Burke," she acknowledged coolly. "I'm surprised to see you so far from Colfax." "Mr. Whitfield is a persuasive man," Burke said, his eyes flicking between Beatrice and Hank. "He's offering a substantial reward for your safe return." "I'm not missing, Sheriff," Beatrice stated firmly. I left of my own free will and I have no intention of returning. Burke shifted uncomfortably. Madam, a wife's place is with her husband. The law also recognizes a woman's right to safety, Eleanor interrupted, sweeping into the room. My niece has filed for divorce on grounds of cruelty. Unless you have a warrant for her arrest, Sheriff, I must ask you to leave my home. Burke's face reddened. No warrant, madam, but Mr. Whitfield is on his way to San Francisco as we speak. He's determined to reclaim his wife. Then he'll be disappointed, Eleanor said dismissively. Good day, Sheriff. After Burke departed, Eleanor turned to Beatrice and Hank. We need to be prepared. Harold Whitfield isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. I won't let him near Beatrice, Hank promised, his expression fierce. Violence won't solve this, Eleanor cautioned. We need to win legally, definitively. She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on a side table. I'll speak with the mayor tonight at the opera. Richard owes me several favors. Perhaps we can arrange for some official protection until the divorce proceedings are complete. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Eleanor's influence secured a promise from the police chief to station an officer outside her home. Harrington worked diligently on the divorce petition, even locating Martha, the former maid, who agreed to testify about Harold's abusive behavior. Through it all, Hank remained constantly at Beatrice's side, a steady, protective presence. They spent quiet evenings in Eleanor's garden, speaking of their hopes for the future, perhaps a small farm near the coast, where Hank could raise horses and Beatrice could finally pursue her teaching ambitions. You'd be content with such a simple life? Hank asked one evening as they watched the sunset from a wrought iron bench. After living in Whitfield's mansion, Beatrice leaned against his shoulder. That wasn't living, Hank. It was existing. I'd rather have a one-room cabin with someone who respects me than a palace with someone who sees me as property. Hank kissed the top of her head. I can promise at least 2 rooms, he said with a smile in his voice. Their peaceful interlude ended abruptly the following morning when Harold Whitfield himself appeared at Eleanor's door, accompanied by Sheriff Burke and 2 other men. I demand to see my wife, he announced when Eleanor answered his knock. Your soon-to-be ex-wife has no desire to see you, Harold, Eleanor replied coldly. Please remove yourself from my property before I call the police. Harold's handsome face twisted with rage. You can't hide her from me, Eleanor. She is legally my wife, and I have every right. You forfeited any rights when you began treating her as a possession rather than a person, Eleanor interrupted. The divorce proceedings have begun. I suggest you consult with your lawyer rather than harassing us. This ridiculous divorce will never be granted, Harold sneered. No judge in California would rule against me in favor of a hysterical woman. Perhaps not, came a new voice as Beatrice stepped into the doorway, Hank a protective shadow behind her. But they might rule in favor of a woman bearing the scars of your discipline, with witnesses to testify to your cruelty. Harold's eyes narrowed as he spotted Hank. So this is why you ran, he spat. You've taken up with this nobody. Mr. Voss has shown me more respect in 3 weeks than you managed in 5 years, Beatrice replied evenly. And my relationship with him began after I left you, not before, though I doubt a judge would blame me if it had. Harold lunged forward suddenly, reaching for Beatrice. You ungrateful whore. He never finished the sentence. Hank stepped between them, his fist connecting with Harold's jaw with enough force to send the smaller man staggering backward down the steps. Sheriff Burke and Harold's men moved to intervene, but found themselves facing the barrel of Eleanor's small but lethal-looking derringer. I wouldn't, gentlemen, she advised calmly. I'm an excellent shot, and California law permits me to defend my home against intruders." Harold wiped blood from his split lip, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," he promised. "I'll see both of you ruined before I let you make a fool of me." "You've managed that quite effectively on your own, Harold," Alina observed. "Now leave before I decide the social embarrassment of shooting you is worth the satisfaction it would bring." After Harold and his men departed, Beatrice sagged against the doorframe, trembling with reaction. "He'll never stop," she whispered. "Never." Hank wrapped his arms around her. "He will," he promised. "One way or another, this will end Beatrice." That evening, Alina hosted a small dinner party attended by several influential San Franciscans, a judge, the newspaper editor, and two prominent businessmen with their wives. It was, Beatrice realized, a calculated move to introduce her to society as Alina's niece rather than Harold Whitfield's runaway wife. "Public opinion matters in cases like yours," Alina explained as she helped Beatrice dress for dinner in a modest but elegant blue gown. "If society ladies sympathize with you, their husbands often follow suit, and those husbands sit on juries and make business deals." The strategy proved effective. The women were charmed by Beatrice's quiet dignity and obvious education, while the men were impressed by Hank's straightforward manner and evident devotion to her. By the end of the evening, Beatrice had invitations to several upcoming social events and promises of support from influential quarters. The divorce proceedings formally began the following week. As Harrington had warned, Harold spared no effort to paint Beatrice as unstable and unfaithful. He claimed she had fabricated stories of abuse to justify running away with a lover, and demanded her return to his care. Beatrice endured hours of hostile questioning on the witness stand, maintaining her composure even as Harold's lawyer tried to provoke emotional outbursts that would support claims of hysteria. When asked to show the court her scars, the thin white line across her back from Harold's riding crop, the burn mark on her shoulder from a cigar, she did so without shame, her steady gaze fixed on the judge rather than on her husband's furious face. Martha's testimony proved crucial. The former maid described in detail the injuries she had treated over the years, the sounds of violence she had heard through closed doors, and Harold's cold instructions to clean her up afterward. "He said a man had the right to discipline his wife as he saw fit," Martha told the court. "That Mrs. Whitfield needed to learn her place." Hank testified about finding Beatrice fleeing through the woods, wounded and terrified. His account of their subsequent pursuit by Harold's men, culminating in the gunfight at the coastal village, painted a damning picture of a husband determined to reclaim his wife by any means necessary. Throughout the proceedings, Alina's social connections proved invaluable. The judge, swayed by public opinion turning against Harold, ruled consistently in Beatrice's favor on procedural matters. The newspaper coverage, influenced by Alina's friendship with the editor, presented Beatrice sympathetically as a woman seeking freedom from tyranny rather than a wife shirking her duties. As the trial progressed, Harold grew increasingly desperate. His final move came one evening when Beatrice and Hank were returning from a meeting with Harrington. As they walked the short distance from the lawyer's office to where their carriage waited, two men emerged from an alleyway, grabbing Beatrice and attempting to drag her toward a waiting wagon. Hank reacted instantly, tackling the first man while Beatrice, putting her shooting lessons to use, drew her small revolver and fired a warning shot that sent the second attacker fleeing. The commotion brought police running, and the captured assailant quickly confessed that Whitfield had hired them to abduct his wife and take her to a waiting ship bound for Europe. This final, criminal act sealed Harold's fate. The judge granted the divorce the following day. With unusually favorable terms, Beatrice received a significant settlement from Harold's fortune, and a restraining order preventing him from approaching within 100 yards of her. Most satisfying of all, the scandal destroyed Harold's social standing. Business associates distanced themselves. Invitations to social events dried up, and he was eventually forced to leave California altogether, his reputation in ruins. "It's over," Beatrice whispered as they left the courthouse, the final papers in hand. "I'm free." Hank lifted her hand to his lips. "Completely free," he agreed, "to make whatever choice your heart desires." Beatrice smiled up at him. "My heart made its choice the day you barred that cabin door and said I'd never go back." 1 month later, on a clear autumn morning, Beatrice stood beside Hank in Aliner's garden as a minister pronounced them husband and wife. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by the friends they'd made during their time in San Francisco. Aliner, of course, Harrington and his wife Martha, and several others who had supported them through the difficult months. "Mrs. Voss," Hank murmured as they shared their first kiss as a married couple. "I like the sound of that." "As do I, Mr. Voss," Beatrice replied, her heart overflowing with happiness. They had purchased a small property north of the city, 20 acres, with a view of the ocean, a modest house, and a stable where Hank could pursue his dream of breeding and training horses. Beatrice had already arranged to teach at the local school 3 days a week. While spending the remaining time writing the poetry she'd been forced to abandon during her first marriage. As they departed Aliner's home that evening, bound for their new life together, Beatrice paused to embrace her aunt. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Aliner cupped her niece's face in her hands. "I only wish I could have helped you sooner, my dear. But now, you have your whole life ahead of you, a life of your own choosing." "Our life," Beatrice corrected, smiling at Hank as he loaded the last of their belongings into the wagon. "Indeed," Aliner agreed, "and I expect frequent visits and detailed letters." "You'll have both," Beatrice promised. The journey to their new home took less than a day, a sharp contrast to their arduous flight from Colfax months earlier. As they crested the final hill and their property came into view, bathed in the golden light of sunset, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness settle deep in her soul. Hank drew the wagon to a halt before the house, a whitewashed structure with blue shutters and a wide porch overlooking the Pacific. Before Beatrice could dismount, he circled to her side and lifted her into his arms. "I believe there's a tradition to uphold," he explained with a grin, carrying her toward the door. Beatrice laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Far be it from me to argue with tradition, Mr. Voss." He paused at the threshold, looking down at her with an expression of such tenderness it brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. "Welcome home, Beatrice," he said softly, pushing the door open with his foot and carrying her inside. Their new home was simply furnished but comfortable, with large windows to capture the ocean view and a stone fireplace to ward off the coastal chill. Hank had spent the past weeks preparing it, determined that everything would be perfect for their arrival. That night, they stood on their porch watching the stars emerge over the water, Beatrice leaning back against Hank's chest, his arms encircling her waist. "Are you happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Beatrice turned in his embrace to face him. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and pain dissolving in the heat of their connection. When they finally parted, breathless, Hank lifted Beatrice into his arms once more and carried her to their bedroom. Their coming together was tender at first, Hank acutely aware of Beatrice's past experiences, Beatrice shy despite her desire. But as the night progressed, inhibitions fell away, replaced by a passion neither had fully anticipated. In Hank's gentle strength, Beatrice discovered pleasures her first marriage had never hinted at. In Beatrice's responsive warmth, Hank found healing for wounds he'd thought permanent. "I love you," Beatrice whispered as dawn approached, her head pillowed on Hank's chest. "I think I've loved you since that first day when you barred the door and promised I'd never go back." Hank's fingers traced lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "I was lost until I found you," he confessed. "Living but not alive. You gave me purpose again, Beatrice." "And you gave me freedom," she replied, pressing a kiss over his heart. The years that followed brought challenges, as all lives do, but never more than they could weather together. The horse breeding business prospered under Hank's expert care, while Beatrice's reputation as both teacher and poet grew steadily. 2 years after their marriage, they welcomed a son, William, followed 3 years later by twin daughters, Emily and Grace. On quiet evenings, with their children asleep and the sound of the ocean a constant backdrop to their lives, Beatrice would sometimes reflect on how close she had come to accepting a life of misery as her fate. How a moment of courage, the decision to flee, to risk everything for a chance at freedom, had led to happiness beyond measure. And Hank, watching her in these moments of contemplation, would remember the terrified woman who had appeared in the forest that day, the strength she had shown through their journey, and think himself the most fortunate of men to have found his heart's companion so unexpectedly. On their 20th anniversary, as they sat on that same porch watching their now teenage children playing on the beach below, Hank presented Beatrice with a small wooden box. Inside, she found a simple gold locket. When opened, it revealed a tiny painted cabin in the woods, a door firmly closed against the outside world. "To remind us where we began," Hank explained, fastening it around her neck. Beatrice touched the locket gently, then reached for her husband's hand. "I've never needed reminding," she said softly. "Some moments change everything. That day when I begged you not to make me go back and you barred the door. And said you're never going back," Hank finished for her, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "Best promise I ever made." "And kept," Beatrice added, leaning into his embrace as the sun set over their home, their life, their love, all chosen, all cherished, all gloriously free.